the Kremlin can always make a play here, Maddie, to say, oh, yeah, those attacks. Yeah. That was yesterday. Look, we want to come in and we want to have a real talk here, right? And by the way, they might do what Netanyahu just did. Said, "Oh, we've nominated you for the Nobel Peace Prize. Isn't that wonderful?" And you just don't know, Maddie, because they could play that. And are there any adults in the room in Washington to remind Trump they are playing you?
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've had Professor Scott Lucas on the show. He's from the Clinton Institute at the University of College Dublin. We've spoken about the fact that Donald Trump says he is rearming Ukraine after that pause from the Pentagon. So all that today, we talk about the backflip, how he's responding behind closed doors to the fact that Vladimir Putin is not playing nice with Donald Trump. So will there be retaliation on his front? So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube page, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Scott Lucas, a professor of American and International Studies at the Clinton Institute at the University of College Dublin. Thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Hey, thank you so much for having me here, Maddie.
So much for you and I to get into, as we love to spend, we could spend an hour or more speaking about what's happening in Trumpland. But let's start off with what's happened when it comes to the United States' involvement with Ukraine. Now, Donald Trump on Monday, he told reporters that the US will rearm Ukraine only days after the Pentagon put this pause on sending air defense missiles, Hellfire missiles, artillery rounds, and precision-guided rocket missiles. Trump said, look, they have to be able to defend themselves. They're getting hit very hard now. We're going to send some more weapons, defensive weapons primarily, but they're getting hit very, very hard. Now, I want to get your reaction to this backflip, but just so our audience knows, it hasn't been, they're not being hit very hard in the last few days, as in it hasn't just started in the last few days. Russia has been striking Ukraine quite hard in the last 2 months. So I just want to make that clear. But yes, Scott, I want to get your reaction to this backflip from Donald Trump.
You know, the easy take on this is that this is more of Trump's unpredictability. It's part of his chaos. You know, and we know that. But the wider story here, which is just as significant, is it's the unpredictability and chaos within the Trump administration. So the backstory is very important here on how these arms were cut off last week. Now, these were arms that were authorized by the Biden administration. We need to also make that clear. This was not military weapons that the Trump administration has said, yeah, let's give more to Ukraine. It's always been a question of will they allow the existing aid to go through. Now, they had done so in recent weeks, but then there was a Pentagon official, a guy named Elbridge Colby, probably not someone who's going to get the headlines like a Donald Trump, but he's a very important official. He's director of policy planning, and he said, I'm going to have a review of Pentagon weapon stocks, and this review, Colby said, well, we need these weapons for ourselves. We can't give them to Ukraine. And as you mentioned, we're talking about especially Patriot air defense systems, which are needed against those Russian missile and drone attacks. But we're also talking about anti-tank missiles. We're talking about other forms of rockets that are used by Ukraine to punch back against the Russians. The big thing about Colby is, long before he joined the Trump administration, he was an opponent of aid to Ukraine, or at least a skeptic of aid to Ukraine. He would prefer, he's part of that Trump camp that would prefer not to deal with European security. They want to focus on China. The confrontation is with China and Iran. So Europe can take care of itself. Now, Colby makes this recommendation, and it works itself up to Pete Hegseth. And we all know that Pistol Pete, and by the way, I need to say, Pistol Pete Maravich, we've got a commenter who always says, don't use this name in vain. Pistol Pete Maravich is one of the best basketball players in history. And the reason why I don't like Hegseth is because he drags that into the mud by being a different kind of Pistol Pete. And that is, he just fires off his mouth, or he fires off a decision without having anything to back it up. And in this case, what he did without informing other officials in the Pentagon, without consulting the State Department, without consulting the National Security Council, and we don't know if he even consulted the White House, he said, that's it. We're going to hold up these arms for Ukraine, even as they sat on a tarmac in Poland. And everybody in Ukraine is going, wait, we're in this crisis moment where Russia's just fired more than 550 missiles and drones at us in a single night. And while the casualty levels are relatively low, that's because people are sitting and sheltering for hours, right? And not being able to live their lives. So Hegseth has done this. And we went through a few days of trying to unwind that decision. And what is interesting now to bring it to Trump, however, is, okay, why did Trump shift? Once more, it's a story of phone calls and the last person to get to Trump. He talks to Putin on last Thursday. Now, a lot of people miss this because this was in the middle of the big fight over the big, not so beautiful bill that finally passed. But that was a conversation that went on for some time between him and Putin held firm to the ultimatum, the root causes of the conflict. We're not going to stop fighting until we deal with the root causes of the conflict, which is Kremlin speak for, we want to seize this Ukrainian territory, about 20% of Ukraine. We want sanctions lifted on us, and we want the fall of the Zelensky government, and we want a weak Ukraine with no security guarantees from the West, including NATO membership. Now, what was interesting is Trump went onto social. And again, a lot of people didn't clock it because of the domestic story that was going on. And Trump said, I'm very disappointed in this. I'm really disappointed that, he wants to keep on fighting. Next day, July the 4th, Trump has a phone call with Zelensky. 40 minutes. Both sides said it went relatively well. In other words, Zelensky worked on Trump and said, we're the ones that are suffering here. We're the ones that are taking the damage. We're not the ones who want this war. We don't want the killing to take place. And it was after that phone call on the Friday that Trump said, they're getting hit hard. They need these defensive weapons. Works its way through. And here we are as I speak to you now on Tuesday, where the decision's been confirmed by the Pentagon, by the adults in the room, that yes, the arms supplies will resume.
Yeah, and it was interesting to see Donald Trump, as you say, take that phone call with Vladimir Putin on Thursday and then take a phone call with Zelensky after on the Friday. And then, of course, Russia launches this insane strike on Ukraine Friday overnight on July 4th, which I don't know if there's any correlation between that and Putin's decision. But Scott, you mentioned that there's this kind of lack of who ordered this pause, why no one was speaking about it. And the thing is that Politico reported this very early last week, but then the Wall Street Journal reported on Monday that while Trump did direct the Pentagon to do a review on the US military stockpile after US forces bombed Iran's nuclear facilities, he didn't order the department to pause sending these missiles and munitions to Ukraine that was sitting in Poland, as you said. So he did tell Zelensky, look, apologies, I didn't actually orchestrate this. Now, while I find that positive news that Donald Trump would actually own up to Zelensky and say, so sorry, that wasn't me, it does show that there is this lack of communication in the departments, in the White House, that how does the US president not have final call over sending these much needed weaponry to Ukraine that are literally in Poland already?
Because they've gutted the command and control within the administration. I mean, we can apply this across the whole U.S. government, but ever since Trump came into office in January, this was the threat, that this purge of the agencies. And the Pentagon has lost a lot of its top staff. The National Security Council has lost a large amount of its staff. Now they're starting to put staff back in there because of how many crises the U.S. is facing. But they gut all the staff. They put in people who simply are not qualified at the top of departments. And yeah, I'm talking about Pistol Pete, right? And so where are you now? Remember, we don't have an effective national security advisor. They got...
To interrupt you and just validate your point, I do want to say for our viewers and listeners that I spoke to John Bolton last week, and he actually puts this lack of communication down to the fact that there is no national security advisor right now. We're not going to count... Yeah. Obviously Mike Waltz left and Marco Rubio is doing a duo job, but no, there's no one person sitting in the National Security Office.
No, and that's key. I mean, National Security Council is not as well known as the State Department or Department of Defense, CIA, but ever since the start of the Cold War in the 40s, that's the key coordinating body for U.S. foreign policy and operations, because that's where all the departments come in and make the key decisions. And what the Trump administration effectively did in the past 6 months is they removed the National Security Council, so they removed that coordination. Now, that meant that when Hegseth, who has done this before, he's done this on some other decisions, he gets out in front on his skis and he orders something without going through a process of linking up with other agencies, checking with other agencies. And in this case, it is interesting as to whether he consulted the White House on this. Now, I'm also thinking there's something missing here, however, because if Hegseth didn't consult the White House, why hasn't he taken the rap for this, in the sense that someone from the White House come back and say, look, this wasn't acceptable what he's done? Because again, a quick reminder, it was also Hegseth that set up the WhatsApp group, the Signal group, to discuss bombing Yemen, and started blabbing to his family and friends all about it. Hegseth should have been turfed out of this administration months ago. You put in a different defense secretary, you get a decent national security advisor in, but that ain't the way Trumpland works.
Well, Mike Waltz take the fall for that. Mike Waltz was the guinea pig, the scapegoat.
Yeah. And he was a scapegoat. I mean, Waltz made some mistakes in the way that group operated, but Hegseth is the one that was putting the plans out there, and he should have gone as well as Waltz. But that brings me back to your point, which is a positive. Look, whether Trump is covering his back or an advisor is covering the back with the apology, or whether he genuinely didn't know, or whether he did know but he's covering it up, or whether he genuinely didn't know what Hegseth did, it means that in a few days you and I could be talking about some other cockamamie decision that they make. And the Europeans know this, which means the Europeans, as we are talking, they are talking right now about next steps on Ukraine, and not just simply about military considerations. The EU is on the verge of a major sanctions package. Is the U.S. going to join the sanctions against Russia and increase the pressure? And perhaps most importantly, is the U.S. going to get on board and tell Putin, stop messing around, we want this 30-day ceasefire. And if you don't have this 30-day ceasefire, then we are going to not only accept the EU sanctions, we're going to accept the sanctions bill coming out of Congress, which is backed by Trump's friend Lindsey Graham.
And we'll get into that, actually. We can get into it now. But, Scott, I'm kind of finding the word ceasefire redundant these days when it comes to Russia-Ukraine, because Putin's army are not going to respect a ceasefire. It's almost like... Look, I want to read you out this quote, because, as I mentioned, Putin launched this attack on July 4th, only hours after he spoke to President Trump, 550 drones and missiles. On Monday, before Trump had this meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu, he told reporters, I'm disappointed, frankly, that President Putin hasn't stopped. I'm not happy about it. I'm not happy with President Putin at all, but this is something that would never have happened if I were president. I wonder... is Donald Trump finally starting to realise that peace negotiations are off the cards, ceasefire discussions are potentially off the cards as well, and that there's really no way for him to be, putting this out of the deal, working a deal with a dictator who has no plans to end a war, not that he calls it a war, unless he's forced to?
I hope he realizes it, Maddie. I would hope so. The fact here is that we've been in this position, as you mentioned, for several months, and that the U.S. and Russia started direct talks back in February. And even during those direct talks, Russia was ramping up the strikes on Ukraine. So it's quite clear what's happening. And the reason why I'm skeptical here is, let's go back to, what does Donald Trump want? Donald Trump wants the Nobel Peace Prize. Everybody shouted out all together. And you are now sitting with this bizarre interlocking of three different places where Trump is going out and making statements. He's been checked in making statements about Ukraine, Russia, because of what Russia has done. But you talk about Israel and Gaza, or Israel and Iran, I should say. He's now saying, we're going to resume talks with the Iranians. We'll get a settlement with the Iranians, something the Iranians flatly denied today. And he's saying with Gaza, he declared a ceasefire with Israel and Gaza last week when no one had agreed to it. He just simply said, I'm so happy they've agreed to the ceasefire. And of course, black comedy, it didn't stop any of the attacks. It didn't stop the humanitarian aid cutoff. He is desperate. And so the Kremlin can always make a play here, Maddie, to say, oh, yeah, those attacks. Yeah, that was yesterday. Look, we want to come in and we want to have a real talk here, right? And by the way, they might do what Netanyahu just did, said, "Oh, we've nominated you for the Nobel Peace Prize. Isn't that wonderful?" And you just don't know, Maddie, because they could play that. And are there any adults in the room in Washington to remind Trump they are playing you? They aren't going to do this because, let me just game it out really quickly. Just put it out there. What's the alternative, Maddie, that we're talking about? Ukraine is going to be divided for the foreseeable future. Europe knows it. Ukraine knows it. The question here is how do you prevent the rest of Ukraine that is not occupied? How do you give it security? And how do you give it stability, especially for economic recovery? You give it economic assistance. You give it military aid to bolster itself. You provide the security guarantees, and then you give Ukraine the path into the EU, and if not the path into NATO, you give it effectively the equivalent of what's called the Article 5 guarantee. That if NATO is attacked again, then there will be an increased involvement by that. You need to get the U.S. to back that. You need them to get to the support that was given for West Germany in the Cold War when the Soviets had taken over East Germany. And unfortunately, that requires a level of planning and detail that I'm not sure is within Trump's wheelhouse, and I'm not sure he's got advisors who really want to be dedicated to that as well, apart maybe from the envoy Keith Kellogg and maybe Marco Rubio, if he could stop trying to please everybody in the administration all of the time.
I think that the main thing that needs to happen, Scott, is for Donald Trump to shake off this mentality that he can orchestrate a peace deal with Putin and not make an enemy of Putin, because it's clear that they just won't work together. If this war comes to an end, it's going to be because Putin was forced to, whether that's through economic ways or whether it's through the fact that Ukraine has given so many resources and help that they win this on their own with the help of course, foreign partners. But Donald Trump can't do this unless he makes an enemy with Putin. And what I wonder is behind closed doors, do we think that Trump is getting very pissed off that Putin keeps showing him that they're not friends, that he's not willing to work with him?
Oh, I think that anger is genuine that Trump's had. And again, let's bring in the fact Trump can turn on people, as we've seen with the Elon Musk affair that takes place. And despite the fact that Russia has been instrumental in putting Trump into office, no, Russiagate wasn't a hoax, by the way, all you folks. They helped put him into office in 2016. They provided all kinds of assistance when he was in and out of office. They've maintained all kinds of links with people in the Trump camp. But no, the point here is that Trump's friendship with Putin is not his priority right now. Trump's priority is to get a deal that makes him look like the peacemaker. That's his priority, and Putin stands in the way of that. Again, Russia's not going to give that. So where do you go with that? What we're waiting to see is that even without the U.S. support, Ukraine's been absolutely punishing Russia behind the front lines. In the past week alone, they've hit several key installations supporting the Russian invasion. They've hit a large chemical plant. They've hit a key oil refinery and an installation there. They've hit a couple of the big makers of electrical components for the military. The Russians now are facing daily Ukrainian drone strikes on their military facilities, and which is also disrupting Russian life. Have a look at the airports last week and how they were effectively shut down with more than 2,000 flights either delayed or canceled in the Moscow area. So that type of, this isn't just simply Ukraine defending. They can hit back. And if you look specifically at the support for drone manufacture in Ukraine, which the Europeans are doing, they could hit back even harder. Now, will the U.S. get on board with that? If Putin will not come to the table, will they support Ukraine hitting even harder against Russia to just keep pushing the Russians back? And the big key is, will the Americans get on board with the air defenses? Because that's the one thing where Putin has the advantage, that Ukraine's air defenses are overstretched right now. And until you provide the air defenses to stop that, Putin's always going to think he can break civilian resistance in Ukraine. He's wrong, but he's always going to think he can break the resistance there.
And the thing is, Scott, is that, yes, we're nearing towards the end of Biden's military stockpile, as you mentioned. It's estimated to be within the next few months. Earlier reports said around June, but of course we're now in July. Some reports say it's probably heading towards the start of spring, that whatever the Biden administration said yes to will probably run out by then. But the thing is that any military analyst will tell you is that, as you mentioned, is that the Ukrainian army are incredibly innovative with the little resources that they have, and they're holding off Russian forces. They're a lot more experienced. So a little does go a long way when it comes to the Ukrainian army. I wonder, what do you think the likelihood is that the Trump administration do sign off on rearming Ukraine with more weaponry under the Trump administration for the foreseeable next few months after the Biden administration's stockpile does run out?
Don't know. To be honest with you, I don't know. I think the problem here is that even if Trump is getting pissed off, who is left there in the administration to join all the dots and to pursue it? Clearly Keith Kellogg, but Kellogg's position is just simply a special envoy to Ukraine. He's not the head of a department. And of course, he's balanced by Trump's purported envoy to Moscow, the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, who we all adore and love, who is effectively still trying to figure out his way out of Vladimir Putin's back pocket, where he's been, tucked away for 6 months. So you've got that issue there. You've got, State Department has got so many crises it's dealing with right now, and it's understaffed because of the chainsaw approach to government. And Rubio is just politically is like rabbit in the headlights in terms of taking a decision that could quite possibly stand up to Trump. We've already dealt with the leadership at the head of the Pentagon. There isn't any. And then, of course, if you talk about the intelligence agencies, your director of national intelligence has been someone who's carried water for the Kremlin in the past, Tulsi Gabbard. So, the loudest voices that are coming out that says we really need to draw this line with the Russians is coming out of Congress, and which takes us back around to the sanctions bill co-sponsored by Lindsey Graham and the Democrat Richard Blumenthal. And the issue here is we're getting into the summer months. So unless the Senate tables that very quickly for consideration, that's not going to come up until the autumn.
Well, Scott, let's get into that. Senators will resume in the tomorrow, July 9th. They will be back after their recess and, of course, the July 4th holiday. Lindsey Graham has been pushing for his sanctions bill to be approved with a vote in the Senate. It is a bipartisan bill, as you mentioned. It would essentially slap any country importing Russian energy with a 500% tariff, a big tariff that the aim, of course, to cripple Russia's economy. A lot of their money comes from their oil. This is funding the war, basically. It is plain and simple as that. He says that he now has the support from Donald Trump after months of back and forth, and perhaps we need to water down this bill, make some modifications. He now says he's got the backing of Donald Trump. Lindsey Graham, he tweeted yesterday, "I very much appreciate Donald Trump's efforts to end the bloodbath in Ukraine, but it takes willing partners. Ukraine has said yes to ceasefires and to any and all meeting requests, while Putin continues to defy peace efforts. It is now time to put more tools in President Trump's toolbox in order to end the war. I expect the Senate will move the bipartisan Russian sanctions bill that will allow tariffs and sanctions to be placed on countries who prop up Putin's war machine and do not help Ukraine. The bill will have a presidential waiver to give President Trump maximum leverage. This bill has 85 co-sponsors and counting. It's time to end the bloodbath." Now, Scott, I've got two questions for you in regards to this situation and this tweet. I think this tweet indicates that Republicans had been pressuring Trump behind closed doors to be more firm in the public on Vladimir Putin. And I do wonder how likely it is that we are going to see a vote this week.
Well, then you got to bring a couple more people into this play. Lindsey Graham is saying that he's got Trump's agreement because he wants to have Trump's agreement. This is the way that you bounce Trump, by saying, oh, yeah. Trump's a great guy. Trump's doing great things. He's supporting this. We don't know if Trump supports this yet. Nor, perhaps equally important, we don't know where J.D. Vance is on this. And given the fact that you have got all the chaos within the administration, Vance does have significant influence because he's got his own agenda that he'll maneuver with. Now, Vance has not been the biggest supporter of European security in the past. And he has not been the biggest supporter of actually dealing with the Russian threat. And he made a statement a few days ago that was just simply outrageous, where he said there are some American politicians or some American commentators, whatever, said some Americans they just divide this. They just want to say this is a case of the good guy versus the bad guy. And of course, the good guy being Europe and Ukraine versus the bad guy, Russia. And I'm like, yeah, JD, that's what it is. Imagine in 41 when someone said, oh gosh, these politicians, they're terrible. They want to divide it up into the good guy, England, versus the bad guy, Germany. Why would they do that? The fact that Vance would come out with that type of outrageous statement, but it would be calculated. He knows what he's doing, is that Vance may be maneuvering to simply push back on this congressional challenge that comes through. We don't know where a key advisor like Stephen Miller is, and I cannot stress enough to you how influential Stephen Miller is. Stephen Miller is mainly on domestic issues, but also in areas of foreign policy because he has got Trump's ear and because he is out for blood. And so you just simply have that uncertainty. I'd say we watch the signals. I'd say if this bill does come up for consideration in the next week or two, it means that they're confident they can get Trump to accept it. If the bill does not come up for consideration in the next week or two, they are not confident of that. What you do not want to do is go to the well, introduce the bill now, and have it defeated by a veto that you cannot override.
And wouldn't that be just incredibly sad if you've got 85 out of the 100 senators already backing it, and then it would look really good on Donald Trump to actually put this through, to publicly come out and support it. So it just pulls into question more concerns about what is going on behind closed doors with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Because so many people will come on the show and say, there's something going on there. He has something over him, something like, and I don't want to get into speculation because we don't have much time, Scott, but I just want to end on this because one of the reasons why there was concerns over how much support the United States would give Ukraine was, of course, constituents of Trump's were sick of paying for other countries fighting battles. And whether that meant military aid, whether that meant actually putting boots on the ground, it was all the same. There was concern we're spending too much money on Ukraine. We're spending too much money on Israel. We're spending too much money anywhere, basically. But over the course of the last few months, I wonder if there's been a shift in that, because the New York Post, they published this poll from Vandenberg Coalition that found that 77% of Trump voters view Russia as a threat. 75% of Trump voters back additional sanctions placed on Russia, and 70% said that it was vital to prevent Russia from invading other European nations. So I wonder if the tide is turning for Trump's constituents, his voters that perhaps now believe, throw the America agenda out the window for now. We need to help Ukraine. We need to rearm them. We need to make sure that Russia gains no more ground, that they have no more wins in this war.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I would also hasten to emphasize that there was always a majority of Americans that favored continuing supporting Ukraine against Russia. Even when Trump first came into office, it's just increased now. And quite clearly, there were fewer Republicans than Democrats that favored the support. The other thing we have to play into the mix here, Maddie, is that there's two houses in Congress. Now, the Senate, of course, is where we talk about this bill originating. But we also know that there are a lot of diehard Trumpists in the House. And we don't know which way they will break on this issue. The House is very unpredictable right now because you got a lot of people in there that, frankly, they're not exactly traditional politicians. Let's just put it that way, right? And you do have a number of Republicans there who are opposed to aid to Ukraine. So I think while their signs are encouraging that Americans don't want to walk away, not just from Ukrainian security, but from European security, I don't know if the dots join up to say that gets this legislation through. Because once again, all it takes is not just Trump, but someone like a J.D. Vance to say, look, let's just hold it up. Let's just back off here. And the problem we've got with Congress, as we saw with the big not so beautiful bill, is that at the end of the day, if Trump and his folks don't want something or do want something, even if you don't like that, quite often people will fold. And man, if John McCain was there and not Lindsey Graham, I might be singing a bit of a different tune, because John McCain, for those who have big memories during Trump 1.0, he's a big supporter in terms of doing the right thing. But he's gone. Lindsey, not exactly the force of nature that McCain was. And I will add one other thing, though, however. I want to see that the Democrats continue to be unified on this. There is an element in that, not amongst Democratic legislators, but amongst some activists on the left who are quite happy to sell Ukraine out as well. And let's just hope that doesn't happen to also cause a further complication here.
Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you, Maddie.